Welcome to Pure Nonfiction, the podcast interviewing documentary filmmakers. I'm your host, Tom Powers. Throughout September, we're focusing on new films premiering at the Toronto International Film Festival, where I work as the documentary programmer. On this episode, I interview the directors behind two films dealing with crime and justice. Later in the program, I'll talk to Steve James, whose new film is about a Chinese-American family defending themselves from prosecution. It's called Abacus, Small Enough to Jail. First, I speak with Jamie Kastner, a Toronto-based filmmaker whose documentaries often bring a wry first-person approach to pop culture, like his last film, The Secret Disco Revolution. But his new film is a stylistic departure into true crime called The Skyjacker's Tale. Jamie crafts a morally ambiguous profile of an American fugitive. In 1972, Ishmael Labit was convicted for a mass shooting known as the Fountain Valley Massacre that left 8 people dead in St. Croix, then part of the U.S. Virgin Islands. 12 years later, having changed his name to Ishmael Muslim Ali, during a prison transfer, he managed to hijack a plane to Cuba, where he now lives. Jamie will explain the rest. We spoke via Skype in August when he was at a cottage in Ontario. At the heart of your film is this character, Ishmael Muslim Ali, as he's known now. Tell me who he is.
Ali, as he is known, as he is known to me anyway, is one of the most wanted U.S. fugitives in Cuba right now. I'd say he's definitely in the top 5 out of an estimated list of 80. And he hijacked a plane to get there successfully after having been convicted of murdering 8 people on a golf course owned by the Rockefellers. And now he's been living safely in Cuba, thanks to the lack of an effective extradition treaty with the States, since 1984. And in just the last month, in fact, the latest leg of developments in the warming of relations between the United States and Cuba is that talks have begun about swapping U.S. fugitives in Cuba for American spies in the U.S.
Now, getting back to the original charges against Ali of killing 8 people on this golf course in St. Croix, tell us more about that crime and what Ali's stance is on it.
In September 1972, 8 people were murdered in this bizarre random crime on a golf course called Fountain Valley, which was owned by the Rockefellers at the time on St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And it happened in mid-afternoon. It was a very strange crime involving 5, at first they thought 6 masked men wearing, balaclavas and fatigues and carrying a whole range of weapons, from a machine gun to pistols and so on. And 8 people were killed and another 8 or so were injured in what was apparently a robbery gone wrong, in which less than $1,000 was taken from the till. Now, this was, an American colony, for lack of a better word, and of the U.S. Virgin Islands. It had been bought by the U.S. Virgin Islands were bought by the U.S. from Denmark in 1925. The island was in transition from a kind of more typical sort of sugarcane-based Caribbean economy, slave economy, let's call it, to a tourism-based economy. At least that's what people like the Rockefellers were hoping.
What can you set up for us for people before they see this film about what Ali's stance is about these accusations?
I should just mention one more thing about the crime. It's a very bizarre crime because so little was taken. Also, the victims were both white and black. And the white people who were killed, the majority were white, were just kind of middle-brow tourists, pilots and flight attendants and their wives having a burger. It wasn't a super fancy place. It might have been relative to the poor people on the island, but just to throw that into the mix, because at different times this has been painted as a racial crime or also all sorts of things, part of a class war, and it's definitely a bizarre crime. Ali has always denied having participated in this crime in any way. Nevertheless, he and 4 other co-defendants, 5 in total, were convicted of the murders and were sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences plus 90 years. He served 12 of those years, mainly in a series of very hardcore maximum security prisons on the mainland U.S., which is relevant because he and others say that these defendants had become too much of a kind of cause célèbre. The trial had become almost OJ-like in the way that it was, it featured the most famous lawyers in America at the time. It would come down to St. Croix to defend them. And in spite of all sorts of controversial things that came up in the trial, they had the book thrown at them several times over. So it seemed part of the kind of judicial strategy to get them off the island, where they were becoming increasingly sort of popular figures who seemed to represent the lot of a lot of the local poor black population, and get them as far away as possible serving their time.
Prominent on Ali's legal team was the radical American lawyer William Kunstler, known for defending the Chicago Seven, the Black Panthers, and the American Indian Movement. The defense team also included Margaret Ratner and her then-husband Michael Ratner. In this clip from The Skyjacker's Tale, Margaret and Michael Ratner each describe the mood in St. Croix.
It was a case where the intimidation level was so high that they really needed to bring somebody from a different part of the country in, because the fear was that the way they control everything else there, would infect the trial.
I mean, if you have somebody who, is the community wants to hang, Bill is the person you want.
It was apparent that it was going to be a very difficult environment to function in. The white population used to make scenes, and make scenes in restaurants if we dared to go into a restaurant. It was difficult to find a place to stay because there were so many bomb threats.
As a footnote, I should mention that Margaret Ratner later went on to marry William Kunstler. But on this case, their formidable defense skills couldn't succeed in freeing Ali.
So over his 12 years in prison, he's a very bright guy, very funny guy as well, and he became a kind of jailhouse lawyer. And after Kunstler and the others, eventually their appeals ran their course, and they moved on to other things. Ali became a kind of a jailhouse lawyer, as I say, and launched several appeals on his own. One of which was successful, not completely successful, but anyway, successful in getting him back to the Virgin Islands twice for a couple of hearings. And on the second one of these, when he realized that while he may have won the battle in terms of this one point he was appealing, but not the war, which to him was to be returned to the Virgin Islands, to serve his time there, amongst his friends and family, where he had a base of support and he felt he could establish his innocence and walk out a free man. Since they seemed dead set against giving him that opportunity and were sending him back to the mainland for, in effect, a third time, it was on that flight on New Year's Eve, 1984, that he hijacked the plane.
Now, how did you, as a filmmaker based in Toronto, come to this story?
I came to this story in the most random and wonderful way. A couple of years ago, after my last film, Secret Disco, had done the rounds, and then one was back successful as it was, one was kind of back at square one, the joys of one-off doc making, as you know all too well. And I was just thinking, God, if I'm going to plunge into this all again, look at the films that are really making a splash at the time. It was like Searching for Sugar Man or Man on Wire, these incredible stories that usually had a trove of found stock footage to boot. They had incredible, almost Hollywood-like third acts. But you just think you can't go, where do you go looking for a Man on Wire or Searching for Sugar Man? Well, feeling ambivalent as I was about the business of one-off docs, I was attempting dutifully to sell out and try to get a factual series going. And I drive this really impractical 30-year-old car. And of course, this necessitated forming a relationship with a good mechanic. So in order to pay for the car bills, I was trying to do a factual series called The Car Whisperer, because this guy was quite an articulate and he is sort of an intellectual, the mechanic. Anyway, the car series went nowhere. However, this kind of politically minded mechanic said, "You do documentaries, don't you? I've got this buddy who goes to Cuba, and he kind of met this guy in a bar." It was the proverbial "met the guy in a bar" story that you hear all the time, and 99 times out of out of 100 you ignore. But this was, we looked him up online in the mechanic's shop and saw that indeed all sorts of conflicting stuff about him being this murderer and hijacking this plane, and a few things saying he was kind of a Black Power hero. And anyway, I was certainly intrigued. I sent some of my previous films, not that they were apropos in any way, incidentally, and a letter via this friend, this Canadian friend, down to Cuba. Next thing you know, I was getting texts saying things like, "Mr. Kestner, you the man. I got good vibes about you." Now, I was internet dating at the time, and I was wondering, is this, some contact I had forgotten about? Anyway, I realized it was a Cuban number. And a week later, I was on a plane reading this kind of vanity published 20-year-old book about the trial and figuring I was going to meet a mass murderer. He was a very charming character and a bright guy, and he began to make a case that was quite different about the original crime. I couldn't figure out why a guy who seemed like such a bright, politically minded person would have been involved in this bizarre crime. And I asked him why and what happened, or kind of like tiptoed towards the topic. He's quite a big guy, even well into his 60s. The likes of me would not want to cross him. He, as I mentioned earlier, he said he had nothing to do with the crime, and told quite a different story. And it was the beginning of my understanding of the many conflicting viewpoints at play in this story, which would be so interesting and challenging to turn into a film.
Now, I want to ask you about the tone of the film, because here you've got this charismatic person telling his version of the story, and elsewhere in the world there are families of 8 victims who, this must be one of the great tragedies of their life. How do you balance those two different points of view?
Not only was the Fountain Valley Massacre a tragedy for the victims, to this day, people on St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands say that this was the worst crime that ever happened on the island, and that it completely ruined tourism. Now, there are many sides to every story, including those claims, but nobody is debating that this massacre was a terrible event, and I doubt that it helped tourism on the island. So it was a really interesting challenge to balance these divergent accounts of what happened. And early on, sometimes sometimes you struggle to the very end to find the title of a film. Sometimes it comes too early. This one came to me quite early in the development stage as I was trying to lay out from this many-tentacled tale, what the story would be. And the word tale came to me early, and it seemed useful because it suggests, like in, of course I forgot, in the Canterbury Tales or whatever, that there are many tales. It suggests we're going to hear primarily one guy's version of these events, and we're not pretending that is objective truth. I prefer stories that are more ambiguous, and I thought that I began to realize how the diametrically opposed versions of events could be to the narrative's strength. You know, you'd have the audience would become kind of like the jury at a trial, and I would try to give each side as much as possible a fair shake at telling their tale, and that way the audience would be deciding at every stage about events big and small along the way, and the ultimate question of guilt in the film.
The Skyjacker's Tale, directed by Jamie Kastner, will have its world premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival this week. We'll be back in a minute talking to Steve James about his new film on a white-collar crime in New York's Chinatown. I hope you'll take time to hear earlier episodes of Pure Nonfiction. If you have an appetite for crime stories, check out our episode about Making a Murderer. I interviewed the filmmakers Moira Demos and Laura Ricciardi. That conversation also includes the Wisconsin defense attorney Stephen Glynn, who's featured in the series.
The single best change that could be made in the American criminal justice system is to change one word, and that is, on a jury verdict, no longer have it say guilty or not guilty, have it say proven or not proven. Because that is what our system's about, and juries who understand that acquit when they have questions. And juries who don't convict, even when they shouldn't.
You can hear more about Making a Murderer on episode 3 of Pure Nonfiction. Subscribe for free on iTunes or go to purenonfiction.net. The filmmaker Steve James has a distinguished documentary career that includes films like Hoop Dreams about high school basketball players, The Interrupters about an anti-violence program, and Life Itself about the film critic Roger Ebert. All those films were set in Chicago, where Steve has lived for decades. But his latest film is set in New York's Chinatown. At the center is a Chinese-American lawyer named Thomas Sun, who was inspired by the film It's a Wonderful Life and started his own bank in Chinatown called Abacus. In this clip, Thomas Sun is rewatching It's a Wonderful Life.
I owe everything to George Bailey. Help him, dear father.
First time I saw It's Wonderful Life, I had tremendous respect for George Bailey, who was the main character. He did so much good for the community.
Mr. and Mrs. Martini, welcome home.
George was lending money to the community residents to buy houses.
Me, Giuseppe Martini, I own my own house.
And that's exactly the same purpose that when we started the bank, it was our motivation to help a lot of people, a lot of immigrants.
After the 2008 financial crisis, banks were under tighter scrutiny for mortgage fraud. But Abacus was the only bank prosecuted by Manhattan DA Cyrus Vance Jr. In Abacus, Small Enough to Jail, we follow Thomas' son, his wife, and grown daughters as they fight to save the bank and their family's reputation. Here's Mrs. Sun in the film.
Cyrus Vance just felt this is easier to attack, especially it's a family bank. But he doesn't realize Tom is not easy to be pushed around. And my girls, they're tough, smart, capable women, so courageous.
I reached Steve James in Chicago by Skype and asked what drew him into this story.
I mean, I think one of the things that makes this story so distinctive and important is that, in the years following the 2008 mortgage crisis, there was a lot of anger out there in the world and across the country that the big banks got away with fines, no criminal prosecution, and actually with bailouts, the whole idea that they were too big to fail. And so what makes this story so compelling and interesting is that Abacus is the only U.S. bank in the wake of that crisis to have been criminally indicted as a bank. And of course, it's a story that virtually no one knows about, even well-read New Yorkers, because the story was covered when the indictments happened and when the the indicted employees were chained together and paraded before the media. There was a story in the New York Times and some of the other places. And then when the decision was made, when the verdict came down, literally 3 years later, there was some coverage. But in between, only the Chinese press in New York City really covered this story.
I've lived in New York for more than 20 years. I'd never heard of Abacus Bank before. Where did this bank come from?
Well, the bank was started by Thomas Sung back in the mid 80s. He was a successful lawyer, but yet, he had this experience of going to his bank in Chinatown with the idea of getting a mortgage. And he discovered that while the banks in Chinatown at that time were willing to have his money as a depositor, when it came to wanting to get a loan, that was a different matter. And this was a successful man. He didn't need to start a bank to make a living, but he was just really struck by that and decided that what he thought the community needed more than anything was a bank that would truly serve the Chinese community there. And that was the inspiration to start the bank.
Now, you're a Chicago guy. The films that you're mostly known for are like Hoop Dreams and The Interrupters and Life Itself, very Chicago-rooted stories. What drew you to this New York Chinatown story?
Well, as you know, Tom, many New York filmmakers are always going out to other cities around the country, Chicago included, and making documentaries, which, it irritates me a little bit when they come into my town. So I just thought, well, it's time for me to go into New York and make a film. That really was my entire motivation in doing this film. No, that's a joke. What drew me to the story was, frankly, the producer on the film, Mark Mitten, one of the producers, along with Julie Goldman. Mark knew one of the Sung daughters who worked at the bank and had been in touch with her, and she had told him, at one point about this incredible ordeal they were going through. And he, when he looked into it, he thought, this is a very interesting story. And so Mark worked with me on Life Itself. He was an executive producer and a co-producer on Life Itself. And I've known Mark for several years now. And he came to me and he said, I think there's this really compelling and interesting story, important story going on in New York that nobody knows about. And that was the impetus for me to want to get involved.
So you mentioned one of Thomas Sung's daughters. We should take a minute to describe this family, because you really get inside this family and they're totally delightful people to spend time with. Thomas Sung has a wife and 4 daughters.
So Thomas Sung, who started the bank, and eventually his daughters, Jill and Vera, decided that they wanted to work in the bank themselves. Vera at one time was a lawyer. She was actually a prosecutor in Brooklyn for a while. And Chanterelle, third sister, was the one sister who was working in District Attorney Cyrus Vance's office as an assistant DA at the time that these charges were brought. And, she, of course, was shocked and just couldn't believe that this was all happening, and eventually left the DA's office, of course, and joined in the fight, that the family was going through. And then there's a fourth sister, Heather, who is a physician. So, yeah, and then, of course, Thomas Sung's wife. I mean, Mrs. Sung is in some ways, she kind of steals the movie, you might say. She is strident and humorous and passionate, and you really do get inside the experience of this family, and they are, as you said, they're quite wonderful to get to know.
The humor in that family was an unexpected quality for me.
Yeah, and for us too. When you hear about what this story's about, you imagine, if Hollywood were to do this film or do this story, and who knows, maybe someday they will, you would imagine that it would be this purely dramatic and inspirational kind of fight that this family goes through to try to save their bank. You wouldn't imagine that it could also be a comedy. And I think that really is one of the things that really struck us about it. And it's one of the reasons, frankly, I love making documentaries so much is that you meet people in situations and they always surprise you. There's always humor in unexpected situations because that's the way in which people often cope with the difficulties that they're going through.
So you begin filming this process mid-trial or over the course of the multi-year process that this was dragging out.
Yeah, we started filming during the trial itself. We is when we were able to start filming. We weren't able to get in the courtroom. It's interesting because the judge seemed open to it, but it's one of those decisions for this level of trial in New York where both the prosecution and the defense have to agree to it as well, or you can't have cameras in the courtroom. So we weren't able to get in the courtroom. But we did have this amazing courtroom illustrator, Christine Cornell, who has done a lot of big trials over the years. We got her to go to the trial for a number of days to do illustrations that became the basis for how we were able to visualize the trial itself.
So ultimately, it was the prosecutors who vetoed your presence in the courtroom?
Well, it's interesting. The prosecutors definitely vetoed it, but also the defense lawyers. The defense lawyers were I don't know. They're lawyers, and the idea of having their performance in the courtroom be filmed didn't appeal to them either. so the family was open to it, but we could not get either the prosecution or the defense to approve it. But really, if just one of them said no, then we were shot down for that.
You do manage to get interviews with Cyrus Vance, the DA, and other people on the prosecution team. What was that like?
We really had to pursue them. I mean, they didn't immediately say yes. We actually tried to get access to Cyrus Vance Jr. and anyone with the DA's office during the course of the trial and had no luck with that. But in the aftermath of the trial, I have to give great credit to one of our co-producers, Nick Berbitsky, who was very dogged about that pursuit and managed to convince both Cyrus Vance and Polly Greenberg, who was at the time of the trial head of the economics crime unit in the DA's office, so was an overseer in this case, convince them to come forward and be interviewed for the film. And I think it's really important that we have their voices in there, and that we really did endeavor to allow them to be fully heard on their side of the case and what they felt was important and why they brought the case. I think too often documentaries settle for one side of a story, and in part because it's often hard to get the other side, but also because they have a more activist orientation. And, sometimes they're not interested in the other side. And that was not the case here. We were very interested to try to fully represent this case and represent what it meant to all parties.
I feel like this, the structure of this story, digging into a trial and a white collar crime, is a little bit different than other kinds of films you've made. Did it feel that way?
Yeah, very much. Yeah, I mean, look, I like to do different kinds of films. I mean, life itself does not look like The Interrupters. I've done other films that are more archivally driven, more interview driven. But I think a lot of the work that I've done that people are most familiar with, films like Hoop Dreams, The Interrupters, are films that are much more sort of verite driven. We have lots of great verite moments in this film, but we also had to go about really telling the story of this trial. And it's interesting because when we went to shoot in the courtroom to get our courtroom shots, we had to hire court officers to be with us during our shoot. It was over the weekend. And so one of the court officers, when we were coming in to shoot, he goes, "So what trial was this that you guys are making a film about?" And when I told him the trial, he goes, abacus. He goes, oh, that was just a paper trial. And I went, well, what do you mean by that? He goes, fraud case, paper, basically meant boring. It wasn't murder. It wasn't some outrageous crazy, story situation that, that typically you would look to make a movie about. This is a very different kind of trial than you even typically see, I think, in most documentaries, let alone my documentaries. And that became a kind of really interesting challenge, I think, for us that we relished, was how to bring to life a trial such as this, where you're not talking about Bank of America and billions of dollars in alleged fraud. You're talking about a small community bank with, fairly chump change level of fraud going on.
And yet, there are real stakes in this case. And I wonder if you can, describe, what is at stake for the Sun family in this case.
If they are found guilty, they run a very serious risk of the bank going out of business. And not only if the bank goes out of business is that, bad for them as a family, because it's their enterprise, their livelihood. It's bad for the community of Chinatown community, of which they have been such an integral part all these years. And then, what's also at stake is their sense of right and wrong for themselves and pride. As Mrs. Sung says at one point, talks about the loss of face if they're found guilty. So it's deeply important for them on so many levels. And then from our point of view, there are also these even greater stakes about questions about justice in America and about who gets justice in America and who goes on trial in America. And that takes us back to the kind of larger questions about the big banks versus a small community bank in Chinatown.
Steve James's film, Abacus: Small Enough to Jail, will make its world premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival this week. Here's a bit of the film's music composed by Joshua Abrams. I want to thank both Jamie Kastner and Steve James for giving us a preview of their films. Normally, Pure Nonfiction releases a new show every Thursday, but while the Toronto International Film Festival is happening, we'll have a Friday bonus. Tomorrow, on episode 20, I speak with two women directors at TIFF. The film Girl Unbound follows the Pakistani squash player Maria Torpakai Wazir. She grew up in Waziristan and received fundamentalist death threats for playing sports. Director Aaron Heidenreich follows Maria on a risky journey.
When you're making these choices to put yourself and potentially your family's lives on the line, does your family support you? In Maria's case, they completely support her. How far do you go to test these limits?
I also speak with Petra Epperlein, who grew up in East Germany. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, Petra's father committed suicide, and she began to wonder if he had been involved with the Stasi secret police. Her new film, Karl Marx City, delves into that family mystery.
There were many open questions, and so after many years, we decided to face the truth and request his files and our own files in the Stasi archive.
You can hear my interviews with Aaron Heidenreich and Petra Epperlein coming up on episode 20. Pure Nonfiction is distributed by the TIFF Podcast Network. Thanks to our team, series producer Michael Scotti Jr., sound mixer Kyle Murphy, web designer Cross Strategy, marketing coordinator Sarah Modo, social media handlers Jordan Smith, Alana Schreiber, and executive producer Rafaela Nehausen. I'm Tom Powers. You can follow me on Twitter at THOMPowers. If you like what you've heard, the best way to support us is to subscribe on iTunes. And please spread the word to your friends. You can read our show notes, learn about live events, and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.